They thought they'd hacked the system, until the system hacked them. It began not with a bang but with a line of code, an idea whispered in obscure corners of the internet. Money without masters, wealth without permission, a revolution hidden inside mathematics. In 2008, as the world's financial towers trembled and the word bankruptcy stalked dinner tables, an unknown figure calling themselves Satoshi Nakamoto dropped a white paper online. Bitcoin, a peer-to-peer electronic cash system. It sounded almost academic, another geek experiment in the wake of disaster, but beneath its plain title hid a spark powerful enough to set the modern world on fire. For those who had watched their savings evaporate in the crash, it felt like vengeance dressed as technology. For dreamers, it was a map to freedom. For opportunists, a once-in-a-generation loophole. And for a strange new tribe that would soon call themselves crypto believers, it was the beginning of faith. At first, the coins were practically worthless, traded like collector's tokens between forum users with names that looked like passwords. 10,000 bitcoins once bought 2 pizzas. Those pizzas, at today's peak valuations, would have been worth hundreds of millions. That number became legend, a parable told at every Bitcoin conference, a reminder of how absurdly fast digital wealth could mutate. By 2011, underground coders and libertarians began mining coins in basements, laptops humming through the night. They weren't after profit, they were chasing liberation. The government couldn't freeze your wallet, the bank couldn't charge a fee, and inflation couldn't erode bits of math. It was digital gold, mined not with picks but processors. The mythology grew. Early adopters became evangelists, then millionaires, then prophets of a new financial dawn. They spoke of decentralization the way preachers spoke of salvation. Yet behind every line of hopeful code lurked the oldest human desires: greed, fear, and the dream of escaping the grind. By 2013, stories began to circulate, ordinary people who had stumbled into riches unimaginable. A programmer who forgot about his old hard drive, later realizing it contained 7,500 bitcoins now lost in a landfill. A college dropout who invested a few $100s and suddenly owned a fortune that made professors look like paupers. News outlets couldn't resist the contrast. Nerds turned millionaires, anonymous geniuses challenging Wall Street. The narrative wrote itself, irresistible and clickable. Exchanges like MTGOX rose to prominence, promising a smooth bridge between the old world of cash and the new one of crypto. At its height, MTGOX handled over 70% of global Bitcoin transactions, until one February morning in 2014, when it vanished into digital smoke, taking $500 million worth of coins with it. Overnight, dreams turned into lawsuits, and the first great collapse in crypto history exposed how fragile this brave new world really was. Yet paradoxically, every scandal seemed to feed the movement. The price fell, then rose again, each crash birthing new believers convinced the next rally would be the one. The losses didn't deter them. They romanticized them, speaking of hodling through the pain, turning financial ruin into a badge of honor. In those years, the language of crypto began to resemble religion. Conferences became pilgrimages. Influencers were apostles. Satoshi, the invisible creator, a digital messiah. As more coins appeared, Ethereum, Litecoin, Ripple, the landscape morphed from ideology to industry. Ethereum's introduction of smart contracts in 2015 ignited an arms race of innovation. Programmers could now build entire financial systems that ran automatically, free from human oversight. It was exhilarating and terrifying. Venture capital flowed like liquid lightning. College kids wrote code that raised millions overnight. Somewhere between utopia and chaos, crypto crossed a line. It stopped being a rebellion and started being a market. And markets, by nature, devour idealism. The rise of initial coin offerings, or ICOs, brought the Wild West roaring back to life. Anyone with a white paper and a website could mint a coin and promise the moon. Investors, drunk on stories of overnight wealth, poured billions into projects that barely existed beyond PowerPoint slides. In 2017, a single coin called Dogecoin, born as a meme, soared over 800% simply because it made people laugh. Logic was obsolete. Emotion was currency. When Bitcoin hit nearly $20,000 in December that year, Headlines screamed that traditional finance was finished. Taxi drivers, barbers, grandmothers, everyone wanted in. Apps made trading feel like gaming, charts danced upward, and YouTubers declared themselves experts. A new class of digital millionaires was born, many of them under 25, their screens glowing with numbers that looked like destiny. They bought Lamborghinis, luxury apartments, entire islands of attention on social media. When Lumbo became a meme, half joke, half prophecy. But as always, bubbles don't burst gently, they detonate. January 2018 brought the cold. Prices cratered, wiping trillions in value across the global market. The same influencers who shouted, "To the moon," vanished overnight. Some vanished literally. Founders of ICOs disappeared with investors' money, leaving trails of broken promises and encrypted wallets. Yet beneath the wreckage, something deeper was happening. The blockchain, the technology itself, continued to hum, indifferent to human folly. Even as prices collapsed, developers kept building, believing that one day the hype would fade and the infrastructure would stand. It was a strange paradox. The dream was wounded but alive. Governments began to notice. China banned crypto exchanges. The US started cracking down on unregistered securities. Regulators framed it as protection. Believers saw it as persecution. Either way, the war between decentralization and authority had begun. As the mainstream world oscillated between fascination and fear, documentaries, podcasts, and Netflix specials turned crypto into spectacle. Characters emerged. The evangelist who preaches freedom but lives in luxury. The coder who refuses fame and guards their anonymity. The scammer who reinvented themselves as a visionary. Every movement needs its heroes and villains, and crypto had both, often in the same person. By 2019, whispers of a new revolution stirred. Decentralized finance, or DeFi. Instead of simply trading coins, users could now lend, borrow, and earn interest without banks. It sounded like alchemy, money generating itself through code. The DeFi boom drew in a new wave of risk takers, people who had missed the first Bitcoin surge and were desperate for a second chance. On Reddit threads and Discord servers, fortunes were made and lost daily. Yield farming, liquidity pools, staking, it was an alphabet soup of opportunity and danger. And when 2020 arrived with a pandemic that froze the physical world, the digital one exploded. Stuck at home, millions looked for escape, for profit, for control. Crypto offered all three. Stimulus checks found their way into trading apps. Bitcoin soared past its previous highs. Ethereum followed. New tokens appeared by the hundreds. Elon Musk tweeted a single word, Dogecoin, and markets moved billions. TikTok teens became market movers. Grand narratives of decentralization blurred with memes and mania. By early 2021, the line between finance and entertainment had dissolved completely. Non-fungible tokens, NFTs, took center stage, selling digital art for millions. Suddenly, ownership itself was redefined. You didn't buy the art, you bought the idea of owning it. Headlines declared the next renaissance. Critics called it a bubble inside a hallucination. But numbers don't debate, they seduce. Artists, influencers, and speculators flooded in. It was once again the gold rush. Only this time the gold was imaginary and the pickaxes were pixels. For every overnight millionaire there were 1,000 quiet losers. The bartender who took out a loan to buy Ethereum at the top. The college student who converted tuition into Shiba Inu tokens, convinced he'd never have to study again. The single mother who followed a Telegram group promising guaranteed 100x returns. Their stories rarely made headlines, but together they formed the shadow of crypto's success, the broken dreams behind the digital gold. When prices began to slide again in late 2021, the shock was slower, more insidious. This time the crash unfolded like erosion, not explosion. Projects once hailed as the future of finance began to fail silently, liquidity drained, tokens depegged. The algorithmic stablecoin Terra Luna, designed to be immune to volatility, collapsed spectacularly in 2022, vaporizing $60 billion in value and shattering trust across the industry. This isn't supposed to happen, investors cried, but code doesn't care about crying. It obeys logic, and logic can be merciless. Through all of it, one truth remained: the human heart doesn't learn easily. Even as wreckage piled high, new coins, new promises, and new believers emerged. Crypto was no longer just a market. It was a mirror reflecting human nature at its rawest. Hope and greed intertwined, innovation shadowed by illusion. The first generation of crypto millionaires had aged into caution, their tweets tinged with nostalgia and regret. Some had sold early and lived quietly. Others had lost everything chasing the next big thing. A few, humbled but unbroken, became advocates for transparency, regulation, and education. They had seen both sides of digital gold, its power to liberate and its capacity to consume. And yet, if you asked them whether it was worth it, many would still whisper yes. Because behind every crash lay the intoxicating memory of the climb, the fleeting moment when they held wealth beyond imagination and felt, however briefly, that they'd escaped gravity itself. The dream began to fracture in 2018 when the first great bubble burst, but no one truly learned. By 2020, liquidity and loneliness collided during global lockdowns, and digital coins became a substitute for hope. Screens glowed in dark apartments while charts rose like fever. New heroes were born. Traders who claimed to have turned hundreds into millions, prophets promising that blockchain would free us from every form of control. But behind every viral success, thousands of silent accounts bled red. Then 2022 arrived like an avalanche. Terra Luna collapsed, dragging $60 billion down in a spiral of code and confusion. FTX, once the paragon of safety, folded overnight, revealing a tangle of deception that erased entire life savings. Crypto winter settled in. The word decentralization no longer sounded like freedom but like abandonment. Across continents, people who had believed in digital destiny faced eviction notices, lawsuits, and disbelief from friends who once envied them. Yet even as headlines mourned the fall, developers kept building, whispering that innovation is born from ashes. By 2023, markets stirred again. Bitcoin crept upward, Ethereum upgraded, and a second wave of optimism swept through Telegram chats and trading floors. It felt like redemption. The diamond hands returned, influencers rebuilt their channels, venture capital flooded back. For a brief season, the world believed the lesson had been learned. But beneath that renewed confidence, the same old ingredients were mixing: leverage, speculation, and collective amnesia. Then came 2025, a year that should have been the industry's victory lap. Bitcoin neared record highs, mainstream funds re-entered, media called it the return of digital gold. But the optimism was fragile. A sudden global liquidity squeeze, a few large fund liquidations, and tighter regulation cracked the surface. Within weeks, prices cascaded down 70%. Fortunes built on margin vanished in a blur of red candles. Analysts later called it the second great liquidation, a technical term for what felt to millions like heartbreak. Traders who had rebuilt from earlier crashes watched the same nightmare unfold again, only faster, crueler, and more public. The data told one story: hundreds of billions wiped from market capitalization in less than a month, billions in liquidations across exchanges, bankruptcies of platforms once hailed as the future. But behind the charts lived another story, the human one. Online communities that had once pulsed with rocket emojis and chants of HODL turned into spaces of exhaustion. Posts shifted from profit screenshots to confessions of fear, anxiety, and sleeplessness. Economists spoke of a new phenomenon, post-crash trauma, where investors couldn't stop refreshing price apps even after losing everything. In forums and group chats, voices shook as people admitted the pressure had become unbearable. Documentaries began to ask not how crypto broke markets but how it broke people. The phrase mental health in crypto trended worldwide, and major exchanges quietly started funding counseling hotlines. Journalists documented the ripple effects: couples selling homes to cover trading debt, young professionals emigrating after bankruptcy, small towns whose mini-mining operations went dark overnight. The psychological toll became impossible to ignore. Analysts who once measured success in percentages began measuring survival and resilience. Governments used the crash as a cautionary tale about financial literacy, and even the loudest evangelists started talking about balance, discipline, and the need for rest. For the first time, the conversation shifted from when moon to what matters. Yet amid the despair, a quieter form of courage appeared. Developers who had seen their tokens collapse still logged on to repair code. Communities turned their remaining funds into cooperatives for recovery. In chat rooms once filled with charts, people began discussing therapy, long walks, and volunteering. The crash that seemed to end everything instead became the catalyst for humility. Out of the wreckage of 2025, the movement found its conscience. Traders spoke openly about burnout and addiction. Creators admitted that chasing virality had hollowed them out. The survivors realized that the technology they worshipped could never replace the human connections they had ignored. Economists later compared 2025 to the dot-com bust or the Great Depression, a violent correction that stripped illusions but left infrastructure. When the charts finally stabilized, the total value of crypto assets had halved, but the number of developers and open-source projects had doubled. It was as though the fire had burned away the greed and left behind the builders. The market's collapse exposed the real frontier, not wealth but wisdom. The future of digital gold, it turned out, depended on whether humanity could learn to value limits as much as potential. When the dust of 2025 finally settled, silence filled the same spaces that once roared with the sound of victory. The servers still hummed, but the voices behind them were subdued. Charts that once pulsed like electric dreams now moved with the slow rhythm of recovery. For a while, it felt as though the entire crypto world had lost its breath. People stopped talking about profit and started talking about purpose. Across the digital landscape, millions of former traders and developers sat staring at their screens, asking themselves the same question. What now? What came next wasn't another boom, it was a reckoning. The industry began to realize that technology alone couldn't build trust. It had to be earned, brick by brick, through transparency, humility, and time. A strange calm settled over the global conversation. The influencers who survived shifted tone from evangelism to honesty. One popular creator began every video with the same line, "I'm not here to sell you hope. I'm here to tell you what hope costs." That phrase spread like wildfire. It became the new motto of a movement learning to walk again after running too fast. In the ashes of speculative chaos, the builders returned. Developers in Seoul, Nairobi, Berlin, Buenos Aires, people who once coded for token bonuses, began to create for meaning. Projects no longer promised instant riches but real-world resilience. Transparent charities, digital ID systems for the unbanked, energy tracking for climate initiatives. Governments that had once treated blockchain as a threat now saw its potential for accountability. In small offices and open-source communities, the idea of crypto was reborn, not as rebellion but as repair. Meanwhile, the personal stories that surfaced after the crash painted a different kind of heroism. There was the young engineer in India who lost everything in leverage trading, disappeared for months, then re-emerged with a platform teaching financial literacy to teenagers. A Brazilian nurse who once mined coins as a side hustle used her earnings to start a mental health nonprofit for burned-out traders. A former hedge fund analyst in London who had watched billions evaporate on her screen, began writing essays about mindfulness and market psychology that went viral across financial media. These weren't the loud voices of a bull market. They were the survivors of a storm, rebuilding from the ground up with quiet conviction. The camera pans over their worlds. A row of laptops in a dim co-working space, the faint buzz of servers, the reflection of charts on tired faces. Yet in those faces there's a new steadiness, a wisdom forged in loss. The music underneath is slower now, composed of piano and breath. A narrator's voice says, they thought they were chasing freedom. What they found was themselves. By 2026, the ecosystem began to transform. Bitcoin didn't skyrocket, it stabilized. Ethereum evolved from experimentation to infrastructure. Governments issued digital bonds on public ledgers. Aid organizations used stablecoins to send funds to disaster zones within minutes. For the first time, the world began to see blockchain not as gambling but as governance. The headlines were smaller, but the impact was larger. Crypto had entered its adulthood. Economists compared the transition to the moment when aviation stopped being spectacle and became transportation. The novelty had faded. The purpose had arrived. The world no longer asked, "Will crypto survive?" It asked, "What will it solve?" Yet for those who had lived through the wild years, the answer carried emotion more than economics. Survivors spoke of perspective, of empathy, of remembering that every data point on a chart represents a human heartbeat. The digital frontier had forced a generation to look inward. Amid this renewal, the ghosts of the past lingered, wallets lost forever, projects abandoned, dreams deferred. But even those relics served as reminders that innovation without integrity always ends in collapse. Conferences in 2026 featured fewer celebrity founders and more community psychologists, ethicists, and teachers. Panel discussions began with mental health check-ins. It was as though the entire culture had learned, painfully, that human well-being must stand at the center of technological progress. In a sunlit office in Tokyo, a small team unveiled a blockchain platform that traced donations to disaster victims in real time. In a school in Ghana, students used a decentralized app to store diplomas that couldn't be forged or lost. In the Philippines, fishermen used tokenized tracking to prove sustainable practices and earn fairer pay. Each project whispered the same message. The promise of crypto was never wealth, it was agency. The film's middle act would show these vignettes in soft light. The whir of solar panels powering a mining rig in a rural community, a grandmother scanning a QR code to receive funds from her son overseas, developers clapping in a modest office after a successful code deployment. The music rises, not triumphant but resolute. The narration, the storm didn't end them. It refined them. Yet the world outside still remembered the excesses. Critics continued to argue that no technology born in speculation could redeem itself. But even they had to admit that something had shifted. Transparency dashboards replaced influencer tweets. Venture firms required mental health protocols for founders. Journalists reported not only on price swings but on ethical standards. The same media that once mocked crypto for its chaos now examined its quiet comeback as a case study in collective learning. And at the heart of that renewal was an unspoken understanding. Decentralization was never about control, it was about connection. The dream wasn't to escape systems, but to rebuild them in a way that included everyone. That realization turned early greed into late gratitude. Those who stayed found that meaning in loss can be more powerful than wealth in abundance. A recurring image ties the narrative together. A lone computer in a dark room, running an old Bitcoin node, its green light blinking like a pulse. The narrator speaks softly, "Somewhere out there a line of code keeps the dream alive." Not because it promises fortune, but because it remembers the first promise, freedom. As the story approaches its end, time moves forward. 2027 arrives quietly. Markets are modestly healthy. Crypto has faded from the front page but woven itself into everyday life. Banking, logistics, education, identity. The frenzy is gone, but the foundation remains. The people who lost everything have, in a strange way, gained clarity. They know now that innovation without compassion is hollow. They speak of stewardship, not conquest. They mentor new entrants, warn against greed, and celebrate patience as the rarest coin. The camera drifts through different cities, Tokyo, Lagos, Sao Paulo, San Francisco, showing murals painted with digital motifs, community centers teaching blockchain basics to children, marketplaces where artisans accept crypto for the first time. The future doesn't look futuristic, it looks human. Then the narrator returns, voice deep and calm. History doesn't move in straight lines. It loops, it crashes, it heals. The rise of digital gold was never just about wealth. It was about belief, our endless search for something we can trust. And every time that trust was broken, we learned again how fragile we are, and how strong we can be when we rebuild together. The closing sequence unfolds. A montage of the old and the new, the landfill where a lost hard drive lies buried beneath snow, the glowing servers of a new blockchain project powering hospitals, the faces of ordinary people staring at screens not with greed but gratitude. The music swells to a final crescendo, merging electronic rhythm with orchestral warmth, symbolizing harmony between machine and heart.